The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Silas Rowan read it once, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup like it was nothing more than a supply order from town. It wasn't nothing. It was a woman. Arriving in 3 weeks. A woman he'd paid $42 to a Chicago matrimonial agency to select, package, and ship to the Montana frontier like a new harness or a cast iron stove. He told himself it was practical, logical. The ranch needed managing. He needed help. Simple as that. What he did not expect, what no man in the Yellowstone Valley could have predicted, was that the woman stepping off that train 3 weeks later would look him dead in the eye, drop her own bag at his feet, and say, in a thick German accent that cut right through the November wind, "I read your list of requirements, Mr. Rowan. All 12 of them. I want you to know, I don't meet a single one." And she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one, a smile that said, "Try and send me back." If you've ever been told exactly who you're supposed to be and refused, this story is for you. Stay with us. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 3 weeks before Elsa Vogel stepped off that train, Silas Rowan had done something he swore he would never do. He'd asked for help. Not from a neighbor, not from the men at the feed store in Billings who liked to talk too much and say too little. He'd written a letter, 3 drafts, because his handwriting was poor and his spelling was worse, to the Continental Matrimonial Agency of Chicago, Illinois. He described himself as honestly as a man like him was capable of, 36 years old, in possession of 214 acres, a functioning well, 4 horses, 11 cattle, and no patience for foolishness. He'd listed what he needed in a wife. He used the word wife the same way he'd used the word shovel. It was a tool, a necessary one. His requirements were practical, hardworking, obedient, quiet. Preferably between the ages of 22 and 28 because younger women adapted easier, or so he believed. Able to cook, to sew, to tend to animals without flinching. Not prone to complaints or what he called unnecessary sentiment. He'd underlined that last part. He mailed the letter on a Friday and didn't think about it again until the reply came 6 weeks later, confirming that a match had been found. Her name was Elsa Vogel, age 30, German-born, currently residing in Chicago's South Side, experienced in domestic labor, farm work, and, the agency added this with what seemed like enthusiasm, remarkable organizational skills. Silas had stared at that phrase for a long moment. He didn't need organizing. His life was already organized. He wrote back, "Send her, tet." The morning Elsa was scheduled to arrive, Silas woke at 4:30, as he always did, fed the horses, checked the fence line on the east pasture where the wire had been sagging since October, ate a bowl of oatmeal standing at the stove, and drove the wagon into Billings without telling anyone where he was going. He'd told no one about the arrangement, not his nearest neighbor, Dale Hutchins, who lived 4 miles west and whose wife Martha had a talent for knowing other people's business before they knew it themselves. Not the men at the feed store. Not the pastor at the small church he attended twice a year out of habit rather than conviction. He'd kept it entirely to himself, the way he kept most things. The train was 40 minutes late. He stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, not out of sentiment, just because the wind was blowing wrong, and watched the other passengers file out. A family with too many children and not enough luggage. 2 men in city suits who looked miserable already. An older woman carrying a birdcage. And then, a woman appeared in the doorway of the second car. She wasn't what he'd pictured. He hadn't pictured much, and he wasn't a man given to picturing, but whatever vague shape had formed in the back of his mind over the past weeks, this wasn't it. She was tall. Not delicate tall, but solidly tall, with wide shoulders and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never once in her life slouched to make herself smaller. Her coat was dark green and slightly worn at the elbows. Her hair was brown, pulled back hard, not a strand out of place despite however many hours she'd been on that train. She carried her own bag. That was the first thing he noticed, practically speaking. She carried her own bag, and she didn't look around helplessly the way he'd half expected. She looked around the platform the way a person looks at a map, systematically, without panic, until she found what she was looking for. She found him. He knew she found him because she stopped scanning and went still for exactly 1 second before she came toward him with long, deliberate strides. Silas put his hat back on. She stopped 2 feet in front of him, set her bag down in the dirt, and extended her hand. Mr. Rowan. Not a question. She knew who he was. Miss Vogel. He shook her hand, firm grip. He'd been right to notice that. I read your letter, she said. The requirements. Good. All 12 of them. Then we're starting with an understanding. She tilted her head just slightly. Her eyes were gray-green, the kind of color that changed depending on what the light was doing. Right now, they were entirely focused on him, which was slightly unsettling in a way he couldn't immediately name. I want you to know, she said, I don't meet a single one. The wind moved between them. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up her bag, not out of chivalry, just because they needed to move, and started toward the wagon. Get in, he said. She did, but she wasn't done talking. The ride back to the ranch was 40 minutes on a good road, and closer to an hour when the November mud had frozen into hard ridges that rattled the wagon wheels. Today it was closer to an hour. Elsa Vogel, it turned out, was not quiet. She asked questions from the moment the wagon pulled out of Billings, and they were not the questions he'd anticipated. She didn't ask about the house. She didn't ask about the sleeping arrangements or whether there were other women nearby. She asked about the soil composition of his eastern field. She asked what his cattle-to-pasture ratio was. She asked whether he'd winterized the water lines yet, and when he said he'd done it in October, she said, Good, but October is often too late in this elevation, in a tone that was not rude exactly, but was also not what he'd call deferential. He told her the elevation wasn't her concern. She said, Everything on a working ranch is my concern, Mr. Rowan. You said so yourself in the letter. You need someone capable of managing the homestead. Managing means following the system already in place. A system only works if it's the best available system. Silence. He kept his eyes on the road. You're not what I asked for, he said finally. No, she agreed without the smallest trace of apology. But I suspect I'm what you need. There's a difference. He had no answer for that. He was a man who prided himself on always having an answer, on never being caught without solid ground beneath him. She'd taken his ground away in under 3 minutes, and what made it worse was that she hadn't done it to be cruel. She'd done it the same way she asked about the soil, matter-of-factly, like it was simply the truth, and truth was always worth speaking. He gripped the reins tighter and said nothing the rest of the way home. The house was not what she'd expected either. He watched her face as she walked through the front door, and she controlled it well, but not perfectly. Her eyes moved quickly, left, right, up to the low ceiling, and he caught the moment she registered how sparse it was. 1 table, 2 chairs, a stove, functional but old, shelves with canned goods lined up with the kind of precision that revealed more about a man's loneliness than he probably knew. No curtains, no rug, no lamp on the mantel, only a working candle. She stood in the center of the room for 3 full seconds. It's a good stove, she said. It was not what she'd wanted to say. He could tell. And something about the fact that she chose to say something kind anyway, rather than pointing out everything that was missing, irritated him more than criticism would have. Room's through there, he said, nodding toward the short hallway. It's private. She nodded once and carried her bag to the doorway, then stopped without turning around. Mr. Rowan, I'd like to understand the terms clearly. The agency outlined the terms. The agency outlined the general arrangement. I'd like to hear it from you. She turned then, and those gray-green eyes were steady and unreadable. What do you expect from me? He should have given her the list, all 12 requirements, the same way he'd written them, clean and simple. Instead, he heard himself say, I expect honesty. She blinked. Just once. He wasn't sure either of them had expected that answer. That, she said quietly, I can give you. She went into the room and closed the door, and Silas Rowan stood in his own kitchen for a long moment, looking at the 2 chairs at the table and thinking, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that there were now two people in this house. It was a strange feeling. He wasn't sure yet if it was good or bad. Das. The first morning established the pattern. Silas woke at 4:30. He went to the kitchen to start the stove and found it already warm. Elsa was already up. She'd made coffee, strong, the way he liked it, which was either a guess or she'd noticed the tin he kept it in and calibrated accordingly, and was standing at the window with her coat on, looking toward the barn. "The water trough by the south paddock," she said without turning. "Is it usually that color?" He looked. In the early gray light, the trough had a thin film of something greenish on the surface. "Algae," he said. "Gets it this time of year." "It needs copper sulfate treatment." "I know." "Have you done it?" "Not yet this season." She turned from the window then and poured coffee into 2 cups, set one on the table in front of the nearest chair, and then went to the stove to start breakfast without being asked. He sat down. He drank the coffee. It was, he had to admit privately and resentfully, very good coffee. Quote, by the end of the first week, she'd reorganized the storage shed. He came back from the eastern fence line to find everything rearranged, tools sorted by function, not by whatever logic had governed their previous placement. Seed bags moved to the higher shelf where moisture couldn't reach them. A labeling system installed using old paint and scrap lumber that he hadn't asked her to do and hadn't given her the materials for, which meant she'd found them herself, which meant she'd explored the property without telling him. He stood in the doorway of the shed for a long moment. Then he went to find her. She was at the chicken coop, feeding the hens with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, which apparently she had. "You reorganized my shed," he said. She didn't look up. "I did." "I didn't ask you to do that." "No." "So why did you?" She straightened then and turned to face him, and there it was again, that directness that didn't leave room for comfortable evasion. "Because the way it was organized cost you 15 minutes every morning finding what you needed. I watched you for 3 days. I timed it." She said it simply, not triumphantly. "It costs you nothing the new way. You'll spend those 15 minutes on something else. That's better." He opened his mouth, closed it. "You timed me," he repeated. Was I wrong? He thought back. 12 minutes, maybe. 14 on the mornings he couldn't find the wire cutters. "You should have asked," he said. "Would you have said yes?" The answer, honestly, was no. And she knew it. And he knew she knew it. And the whole exchange sat between them like a stone neither of them was willing to pick up. "Ask next time," he said, and walked back toward the barn. Behind him, he heard her go back to the chickens without another word. No argument, no final comment. She'd made her point cleanly and let it land, and that was somehow more infuriating than if she'd pushed further, because it meant she understood exactly how much to say and when to stop, and that was a skill he didn't think he'd accounted for in any of his 12 requirements. Baltic. The neighbors found out by the second week. Martha Hutchins came by on a Wednesday, supposedly to return a borrowed pot, but mostly, as Silas was fully aware, to see the woman from Chicago with her own eyes. She sat at Elsa's table, drinking Elsa's coffee, and asking the kind of questions that sounded friendly but were actually inventory. "Where are you from? How long did you live in Chicago? Do you have family? What did you do before?" Elsa answered everything without flinching, but Silas, watching from the doorway with his hat in his hands, noticed she gave exactly as much as was asked, and nothing more. No elaboration, no warmth, but no coldness either. She was polite the way a closed door is polite. Not unwelcoming, exactly, just not open. Martha stayed for 40 minutes. When she left, she told Silas in a voice pitched carefully for only him to hear, "She's not what I expected." "No," he said. "Dale thinks you'll have trouble." "Dale's wrong." Martha gave him a look that said she wasn't sure. Then she got in her wagon and drove back toward the Hutchins spread, and Silas went inside to find Elsa washing the coffee cups with an economy of motion that suggested she had already forgotten Martha was there. "She'll tell people," he said. "I know." Elsa didn't look up from the basin. "What will they say?" He considered the honest answer. "That you're not what I ordered." She was quiet for a moment, then, "And what will you say?" He picked up his hat. He had fence work to do. "I'll say the same thing," he said, and he went outside, and he did not miss the sound that followed him to the door. Not a laugh exactly, but something close to one, low and private, and entirely for herself. The trouble came at the end of the third week. Not the kind of trouble that arrives loudly, the quiet kind, which is always worse. Silas had a system for the cattle rotation that he'd developed over 9 years on this land. He knew this pasture. He knew which sections could carry weight in November and which would be soft beneath the freeze and cost a heifer a leg. He did not write it down because he didn't need to write it down. It was in his body the way walking was. Elsa changed the rotation, not dramatically. She moved 3 of the younger cattle to the southeastern section 2 days earlier than his usual schedule. He found out when he went to count heads in the morning and the numbers were wrong. He found her. "The southeast pasture," he said. She was in the kitchen, working on what would become supper. She set down what she was doing and turned to face him fully because she'd already learned in 3 weeks that he didn't like talking to someone's back. "Yes, that's my decision. The ground in the north section where you had them is softer than it looks," she said. "I walked it yesterday evening. There's a water seep about 40 feet from the fence line that's been thawing and refreezing. If 300-pound steps wrong on that ground, I know my land." "I know you do." Her voice was even, not cold, but solid. "I'm telling you what I found. You moved my cattle." "I did." "Without asking." She met his eyes. "I found out about the seep at dusk. You were already at the north fence, and I couldn't reach you before dark. I made a decision." "That is not your decision to make. A heifer's leg is worth more than an argument about whose decision it was." The silence after that was different from their other silences. It had a different weight. He was angry. Genuinely angry. The cold kind that didn't show on his face because he'd been schooling his face since he was 19 years old. And she could see it, and she didn't back down from it, not an inch. But she also didn't advance. She just waited. He walked out to the southeast pasture, walked the perimeter, found the seep exactly where she'd said it was, and pressed his boot into it and watched the water come up pale and slow around the sole. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to the barn and fed the horses and didn't speak to her for the rest of the day, and she let him have that. And when supper was on the table at 6 o'clock, he sat down and ate it, and it was, he noticed involuntarily, the best meal he'd had in months. Neither of them spoke. But when he got up from the table, he paused at the door and said, without turning, "The heifer, the black-faced one." "Yes?" "She favors her right front. Check her in the morning before I'm up." A pause. "I already noticed," Elsa said quietly. "I was going to." He went to bed. He lay there in the dark and thought, against his will, that of all the things he'd ordered from Chicago, hardware, medicine, once a book on soil management that had actually been quite useful, nothing had arrived the way this woman had arrived. Nothing had rearranged itself in his house and his days and the careful quiet of his life with such complete disregard for the specifications he'd provided. Nothing had left him this tired. Or, he admitted to the ceiling in the honest dark of 3 a.m, this certain that tomorrow was going to be different from today in ways he couldn't predict. He wasn't sure, even now, whether that was a problem. He fell asleep before he could decide. He was wrong about tomorrow being different in ways he couldn't predict. It was worse than that. Tomorrow was different in ways that made him question whether he'd understood anything about his own life for the past 9 years. He found out at breakfast. Elsa set a plate in front of him. Eggs, salt pork, biscuits she'd made from scratch in the dark hours before he was up, and sat down across from him with her own plate, which was something she'd started doing on the 4th day and which still unsettled him in a way he hadn't resolved. He'd eaten alone for 9 years. Having someone across the table changed the air in the room somehow, changed the sound of things, made the silence different, less like absence and more like something that was waiting. "I want to talk about the chicken coop," she said. He poured his coffee. "What about it?" "The ventilation is wrong. In deep winter, you'll lose birds to respiratory infection. I've seen it happen. The gap at the roofline needs to be closed and a lower vent added on the north wall." The coop's been standing 8 years. And how many birds did you lose last February? He didn't answer. 4, she said. I found the record in the supply log on the shelf. 4 hens in 6 weeks. She said it without accusation, just the same flat delivery she used for everything. Soil composition, copper sulfate, cattle rotation. Fact as fact. It wasn't disease. It was the airflow. Cold air drops directly on the roost from that upper gap, and they can't regulate. You've been reading my supply logs. You keep good records. She said it like a compliment, but moved past it immediately. The modification would take 1 afternoon and cost nothing if you have the spare lumber, which you do. I counted it in the shed. Well, he set his cup down. You counted my lumber. I was inventorying. I didn't ask for an inventory. No, she said, and her tone changed by the smallest degree. Not defensive, but patient in a way that suggested she'd already had this argument with herself and resolved it before bringing it to him. But you have materials you don't know you have and needs you don't know you can meet. I thought knowing would help. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. This was the thing about Elsa Vogel that he had not accounted for and could not find a category for in his mind. She was never performing. Most people, in his experience, were performing something. Competence, friendliness, toughness, whatever the situation seemed to require. Elsa simply was. She sat at his table in the early morning dark and told him true things without dressing them up. And the absence of performance in a human being was, he was learning, deeply disorienting to a man who'd spent his adult life reading people's masks rather than their faces. Fine, he said. She blinked. Fine. Which part? The coop. Do it. She nodded once, picked up her fork, and ate her breakfast. He did the same. That was the closest they'd come, in 3.5 weeks, to agreeing on something without a fight first. December arrived the way December always arrived in that part of Montana. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming. One morning, the temperature dropped 15 degrees before noon and didn't come back up. The sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way. The wind came off the mountains with an edge that found every gap in a coat, every unfastened button. Silas doubled his work schedule because in deep winter you either prepared or you suffered, and he'd suffered enough in his first 2 years on the land to have learned that lesson permanently. He was up before 4 now. He was rarely in the house before dark. He ate standing at the stove when he came in and went to bed with the mechanical efficiency of a man who understood that his body was a working tool and sleep was maintenance. Elsa matched him hour for hour. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Some slowing down, some acknowledgement that the work was hard, and the cold was brutal and a woman from Chicago might need accommodation. But she didn't ask for accommodation, and she didn't slow down. She worked the hours he worked and did it without complaint, which he could respect, and she did it without making him feel watched, which he appreciated more than he would ever say out loud. What she did was reorganize the morning routine, not dramatically. Incrementally, over 2 weeks, shifting small things, which tasks happened in which order, how the stove was banked at night so it held heat longer, where the tools for the morning's first jobs were placed so he could move from task to task without crossing the yard twice. He noticed each change the day it happened and said nothing, because the changes were correct, and saying nothing was the closest he could come to admitting that. Dale Hutchins came by the 2nd week of December. Dale was not like his wife, Martha. Martha talked because she wanted to know things. Dale talked because silence made him uncomfortable, and he filled it with whatever was available, which was usually an opinion nobody had requested. He arrived mid-morning with a fence post he claimed to be returning, but which Silas was fairly certain he'd never lent, and he stood in the yard watching Elsa carry feed sacks from the wagon to the storage shed, efficiently, without stopping, one after another, with an expression Silas didn't like. "She's a worker," Dale said. "Yes," Silas said. "Didn't expect that from a city woman." "She wasn't always in the city." Dale hooked his thumbs in his belt and watched her a moment longer. "Still, peculiar arrangement, agency wife." He said it the way some men said things they thought they were too polite to say outright, but said anyway by saying them with a particular inflection. "Martha says she's strange, doesn't warm up easy." "Martha's been here twice." That's enough to form an impression. Silas looked at his neighbor for a long moment. Dale Hutchins was not a bad man. He was the particular kind of ordinary man who believed that the world was organized in categories and that people who didn't fit the categories were the problem rather than the categories. Elsa, he said. She stopped between trips and looked over. This is Dale Hutchins, 4 miles west. She walked over, set down the sack she was carrying, and shook Dale's hand with a firm, brief grip. Mr. Hutchins, your fence line along the creek, the northeast corner, where the cottonwoods are. There's a section that's going to need attention before the ground freezes solid. 3 or 4 posts have shifted. Dale blinked. How do you know my fence line? I walked the property perimeter when I first arrived. It's habit. She said it without apology. You'd want to know before spring, not after. Dale opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He was looking at Elsa. She picked up the sack and went back to work. Dale left 20 minutes later, and Silas heard him talking to Martha that evening. Voices carrying clear in the cold across 4 miles of frozen silence, the way sound sometimes did in winter. And the word peculiar came through twice. He went inside and didn't bother being annoyed about it. The first real fight happened on a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, and it started, like most real fights do, over something that appeared to be one thing, but was actually another thing entirely. It started over the account book. Silas kept his finances in a leather-bound ledger that had belonged to his father and that he maintained with the same precision he applied to everything else. Every dollar in, every dollar out, recorded in a hand that was plain but consistent. He balanced it on the first of every month, and it had never once been wrong, which was a point of private pride. He came in from the evening feed to find Elsa sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her, and a piece of paper beside it covered in her own writing, smaller than his, organized in columns he didn't recognize. He stopped in the doorway. That's my ledger, he said. She looked up without guilt or apology. I know, I was looking at the spring seed projections. I didn't give you permission to look at that. You didn't forbid it. I didn't think I needed to forbid it. He crossed the room in 5 steps and closed the ledger with one hand, not violently, but definitely. That is private. Your seed allocation for the eastern field is 30% below what the acreage can support, she said, as if he hadn't spoken. You're leaving yield on the table every season if you shifted the oat proportion and added a winter rye rotation. Elsa, his voice was quiet. That was the version of his voice that was not quiet at all. She stopped. I understand you see problems, he said, and I understand you see solutions. I have observed this about you every day for 3.5 weeks. But that ledger is mine. This farm is mine. The decisions about what to plant and when and how much are mine, not yours to calculate on a Tuesday evening without asking. The silence after that was different from their usual silences. It had heat in it. Elsa set her pen down carefully. She looked at the closed ledger for a moment and then looked at him, and he could see her doing the thing she sometimes did, finding the version of what she wanted to say that was true without being a weapon. You ordered a wife, she said finally. Not a servant. You wrote that yourself in the letter. Partner in the management of the homestead. Those were your words, Mr. Rowan. A partner consults before acting. A partner is trusted with information. Her voice was still even, but there was something underneath it now, something he hadn't heard before. I have been here 38 days. I have worked every hour you've worked. I fixed your chicken coop and saved your heifer and reorganized your shed and adjusted your cattle rotation, and every single time I have to fight you to have it acknowledged that I did it right. She stopped, took one breath. I don't need you to thank me. I'm not asking for thanks. I'm asking for the simple recognition that I know what I'm doing, that I can be trusted to look at a ledger without it being a crime. He stood very still. The information in that ledger, he started, is just numbers. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not tears, not close to it, but the crack of someone who has kept themselves tightly controlled for too long and has hit a seam. It is just numbers, Silas. I have seen numbers like that my whole life. My father's farm in Saxony, 3 jobs in Chicago so I could send money home. I know what struggling looks like on paper. I know what it looks like when someone is one bad season from real trouble. She met his eyes. I wasn't trying to interfere. I was trying to help. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, my father lost this land once, before I bought it back. Drought year, bad loans, bad decisions. Lost it for 4 years and worked other men's ground to get the money to buy his own back. He said it flatly, without drama, the way men spoke about wounds they'd learned to live with. I keep that ledger because I need to know exactly where I stand. Every dollar, because I have seen what happens when a man doesn't know. Elsa was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that, she said. No, you didn't. He picked up the ledger and held it for a second, and he wasn't sure why, wasn't sure what calculation or instinct or simple exhaustion drove the decision. He set it back down on the table in front of her. The spring projections, show me what you found. She looked at the ledger, looked at him. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything about this situation, he said honestly. Show me anyway. She pulled the ledger back toward her and opened it and slid her paper alongside it and began to explain in the careful, precise way she explained everything. No flourishes, just the numbers and what they meant. And he sat down across from her and listened, and outside the wind moved hard against the north wall of the cabin, and neither of them remarked on it. The thing about living in close quarters with another person, Silas discovered, was that you couldn't maintain a fiction about yourself for very long. He'd been alone long enough that he'd developed a particular understanding of who he was, a man of order, of efficiency, of minimal emotional requirement, a man who didn't need much. This was what he'd told himself, and because there was no one to contradict him, it had calcified into something he'd mistaken for identity. Elsa Vogel contradicted him constantly, and not always with words. She contradicted him by leaving a cup of coffee on the windowsill when she knew he was going to come in from the north barn cold and would pass that window on his way to the door. She didn't say anything about it. It was just there. He didn't say anything either. He picked it up and drank it and felt, against his will, against the entire architecture of himself, something that was simply warmth and not the physical kind. She contradicted him by laughing sometimes. Not at him exactly, but at situations, at the absurdity of particular moments. The morning a chicken escaped into the kitchen and chaos ensued. The afternoon the wagon wheel sank into an unseen soft patch 4 feet from solid ground, and they spent 20 minutes digging it out side by side in silence. Before she straightened up, filthy and breathing hard, looked at the wagon, looked at him, and said, I've had worse Tuesdays. He hadn't meant to laugh. The sound surprised him when it came out. She contradicted him most sharply on a Friday evening when he came inside to find her sitting at the table with a letter in her hands, and she wasn't reading it. She was holding it the way you hold something before you put it away for good. He recognized that quality of stillness. He'd sat like that himself with his father's last letter years ago. He got his coffee, didn't sit, gave her the room. My brother, she said without his asking. In Chicago. He got work at the stockyards. She folded the letter. Dangerous work. Does he know you're here? He knew I was going somewhere. She was quiet a moment. He thought I was making a mistake. Coming to Montana. Coming to a stranger. She set the letter on the table, face down. He said no good arrangement was ever made through an agency. He said I was going to end up working for someone who thought he'd bought himself a maid. The silence had a particular quality. Is he right? Silas asked. She looked at him then, straight on the way she always looked at things. No angle, no deflection. Not entirely, she said. He should have let it go. He knew the shape of the moment and understood that letting it go was the sensible choice. What part is he right about? He heard himself ask. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. You don't see me yet, she said finally. Not fully. You see what I can do. You see whether I'm useful. It's not wrong. It's not cruel. It's just... She stopped, found the right word. Incomplete. He turned that over. He could argue. He had arguments. He'd been treating her with fairness since the day she arrived, had he not? He'd given her privacy, given her the bedroom, given her eventually, grudgingly, access to the ledger. But he thought about the chicken left on the windowsill, the way he noticed it, the way he noticed other things, that her hair, loose in the mornings before she pinned it, reached the middle of her back, that she always checked on the animals one final time at night, even when she thought he was asleep, that she had a small collection of rocks on her windowsill that she'd apparently gathered from the property, and he'd never asked her about them. "I hear you," he said. She seemed to have expected more or less than that, because for just a moment her expression did something unguarded. Then it settled. "Thank you," she said. He went to bed. He lay there in the dark and thought about the word incomplete for a long time, turning it over like a rock she might have placed on a windowsill, examining what was underneath it. The second week of December brought something worse than the cold. It brought the Aldermans. Frank Alderman was a homesteader who'd claimed land 8 miles east 2 years ago and had been slowly, systematically buying up or forcing out smaller operations between himself and the river. He was 45, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of confidence that came not from competence, but from the simple fact that he was bigger than most rooms he walked into and had learned early that this was often enough. He came on a Wednesday with his foreman, a man named Cree, who said nothing and watched everything. Silas saw them from the barn and walked out to meet them in the yard, which was intentional. He preferred conversations to happen where he chose, on ground he'd decided on. "Rowan," Frank Alderman said, not unpleasantly. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I've been here," Silas said. Alderman's eyes moved to the house, then back. "Heard you've got company these days." "I've got a wife." A pause. Alderman smiled, and the smile was the kind that didn't involve his eyes doing anything. "Sure. Heard about that. Interesting arrangement." He looked around the property with the careful, pricing look of a man who'd already decided what something was worth and was just confirming. "I'll get to the point. I'm looking at expanding my operation east. Your water access along the South Creek is something I'd be willing to pay for. It's not for sale. Haven't told you the number yet." "Doesn't matter." Alderman's smile stayed in place. It was the practiced smile of a man who'd done this enough times to know that the first no was never the last one. "Take some time. Talk it over with your wife." He said the last word with a slight hesitation that managed to be both respectful and dismissive at once, a social trick Silas found particularly grating. "Spring might change the math for you." "It won't." Alderman looked at him for a moment with the weighing look, and then nodded once and turned his horse. Cree turned without being told. They rode east. Silas stood in the yard and watched them go. He went inside to find Elsa at the window. "I saw," she said. "Nothing to concern yourself with." She turned from the window. "He's been buying land east of here, 3 operations in 2 years. The Peterson family sold to him in September. I heard about it in town when I went for salt. They didn't want to sell." He looked at her. "How do you know the Petersons didn't want to?" "Because Mrs. Peterson told me." She moved to the stove, checked whatever was in the pot. "I've been talking to people in town when I go, learning the situation." She said it without any awareness that this might seem remarkable. "You own the only reliable water access south of the ridge for 6 miles. He needs it. He'll be back." "I know that." "What are you going to do?" "Nothing yet." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Nothing is a decision." "I know that too." She went back to the pot. He sat down at the table and pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, looking at the floor, running the math on what Frank Alderman's interest meant, and what it would cost to resist it, and what Elsa had just told him, that she'd been in town, talking to people, learning things, the way a person learns things when they've decided that a place is theirs. That was, he realized, what she'd been doing since she arrived, not testing the situation, not waiting to see if she'd stay, treating the land as hers, treating the problems as hers, treating the future as something she was already in. He hadn't ordered that, hadn't known to order it. "Elsa." "Yes." "The Peterson woman. Can you trust what she told you?" "Yes." No hesitation. "All right." He put his hat on the table. "Then sit down. Tell me everything she said." Elsa pulled out the chair across from him. His chair, technically, but she'd stopped treating it as such about 2 weeks in, and sat down and told him everything, in order, clearly, without editorializing. And when she was done, they spent the better part of an hour going through what it meant and what the options were and what each option would cost. He was not used to thinking out loud with another person. He found, to his discomfort, that it was more useful than thinking alone. Problems he would have turned over by himself for days resolved faster with her sitting across from him, pushing back on bad assumptions. He didn't say that, but she might have known it anyway, because when they were done and she got up to finish supper, he caught the edge of an expression on her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The expression of a person who has been told, without words, that they are worth consulting. He made a private note to himself to be more careful about what his face was doing. It was a note he would fail to act on, repeatedly, in the weeks that followed. Christmas was 3 weeks away when Silas discovered that Elsa was afraid of something. He didn't discover it dramatically. He discovered it the way you discover most things about people who are guarded, sideways, through a gap they didn't intend to leave open. It was late. He'd been unable to sleep, which happened sometimes in winter when the wind was doing a particular thing against the north wall that sounded too much like something else he didn't want to think about. He'd come to the kitchen for water and found Elsa sitting at the table in the dark with her coat on over her nightclothes and a piece of paper in front of her that she was writing on by the thin light of a single candle. She looked up when he came in. Didn't startle. She had good instincts, always seemed to know when a sound was him, but her hand moved slightly over the paper. He didn't look at the paper. He got his water and sat down across from her because it was cold and the room was small and sitting was as reasonable as standing. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "No." He drank his water. She put the pen down but left her hand near it. "What are you writing?" he asked. A pause. "A letter." "Your brother?" "No." She was quiet for a moment. "The agency, in Chicago." He felt something go very still in his chest, like a gear catching. "Why?" he said. Flat. Not a question. She looked at the candle. "They send a check-in letter at 60 days to make sure the arrangement is proceeding correctly. You're supposed to confirm whether you want to continue the contract." "I know about the letter." "You haven't written back." He hadn't. He'd received the letter 2 weeks ago and put it in the ledger and not thought about it because he was only now realizing this. The idea of writing back hadn't felt like something that needed doing. The arrangement was what it was. It was proceeding. That was evident. "Are you writing back for me?" he asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice and didn't fully control it. "No." She looked at him then, and there it was. The thing he'd seen only the one time before, with the letter from her brother. The crack. Not fear exactly, but the anticipation of something. The particular anxiety of a person who has been in uncertain situations before and learned that uncertainty resolves itself in specific ways, and most of them aren't good. "I'm writing to ask them what happens, if the arrangement doesn't continue." He was quiet for a long time. "Where would you go?" he said. "Back to Chicago, probably. There are families in the South District who need domestic help. I know people." She said it with the flat steadiness of a person reciting a plan they've already made, a contingency they've already run through. He recognized it because he did the same thing. You don't leave yourself without a plan. "Is that what you want?" he asked. She looked at the candle again. "What I want," she said carefully, "isn't really the governing variable here. I'm asking you what you want." The silence stretched. "I want—" She stopped. Started again. "I like it here. The land. I didn't expect to, but I do. The space of it. The way the sky is different." She shook her head slightly, like she was dismissing something. "That's not practical." "No," he said, "but I asked anyway." She looked at him for a long moment in the candlelight, and her expression did several things in quick succession that he couldn't read all the way through. "You haven't answered the agency's letter," she said. "No." "Why not?" He could say, "Because I haven't had time. Because I forgot. Because winter is demanding and the letter wasn't urgent." Instead he said, "Because it didn't seem like a question that needed answering." She waited. "You're here," he said. "The arrangement is proceeding. That seems like an answer. That's not an answer, Silas. That's just continuing by default. He thought about that. Then I'll write the letter tomorrow, he said, and the answer will be that we continue. She sat with that for a moment. He watched her absorb it, not with relief exactly, more with the careful, measured quality of someone who's learned not to lean too hard on anything until they know it will hold. All right, she said. He got up, got more water even though he didn't need it. Put the candle out when you're done, he said. I will. He went back to bed and lay in the dark and thought about what continuing by default meant and whether it was different from choosing, and decided that for tonight at least, the distinction was less important than the fact that he'd said the words out loud and meant them. The wind still moved against the north wall. It didn't bother him as much now. He slept before the hour was up, and when he rose at 4:30 the kitchen was empty and the candle was out, and on the table there was no letter. Not to the agency and not to anyone, just the clean bare wood of the table and 2 cups already set out for morning, and he stood there and looked at those 2 cups for a long moment before he started the stove. 2 cups. She'd stopped asking if he wanted coffee and started assuming it, and he had never once corrected her, and he understood, standing there in the cold kitchen in the dark, watching the stove begin to warm, that this was what changing looked like. Not dramatic, not declared, just 2 cups on a table where there used to be one, and neither of them saying a word about it. He wrote the letter to the agency the next morning. It took him 4 minutes. He confirmed the arrangement was continuing, signed his name, sealed it, and left it on the table for Elsa to take to town when she went for supplies Thursday. She picked it up without comment, put it in her coat pocket, and that was the end of it. Or so he thought. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know until much later, was that she'd stood at the mail window in the Billings post office for a long moment before sliding that envelope across the counter. The postmaster, a thin man named Garrett, who'd been handling other people's correspondence for 20 years and had developed strong opinions about all of it, said she'd looked at the envelope like she was waiting for it to tell her something. She mailed it anyway. That was Elsa. She moved forward even when she wasn't certain. She'd been doing it her whole life. The cold deepened the 3rd week of December in a way that was different from ordinary winter cold. This was the kind that settled into the ground and stayed, the kind that killed things that hadn't prepared. Silas could feel it in the air before he opened the door each morning, a pressure, a weight, a stillness that meant the temperature had dropped past the point where things moved easily. He added a 2nd round of feed to the morning routine and told Elsa to keep the kitchen stove burning through the night, which cost more wood but was cheaper than sick animals and frostbitten pipes. She'd already been doing it for 4 days without being told. He noticed. Said nothing, but he noticed. What he also noticed, though he filed it away without examining it too closely, was that she'd started coughing. Not badly, not the deep rattling kind that meant real trouble, just a dry catch in the throat, the kind that came from cold air and too many hours outside and not enough sleep. He heard it in the evening sometimes, when the house had gone quiet and there was nothing to distract from small sounds. He heard it once in the early morning through the wall between their rooms. He told himself it was nothing. He'd been telling himself a version of that for weeks, about various things. On the Saturday before Christmas, Dale Hutchins came by again, and this time he brought news. He came alone, without Martha, and his expression when he got off his horse was the particular expression men wore when they were delivering information they didn't entirely want to deliver. Alderman's been to see the Kowalski family, he said, before he'd even fully dismounted. Made them an offer on their water rights, east branch of the creek. Silas stood very still. Did they take it? Not yet, but Emil Kowalski's got 3 kids and a sick wife, and Alderman's number was good enough to make a man think twice. Dale pulled his coat tighter. If he gets the Kowalski water rights and yours, he controls the south access for the whole valley. Every operation between here and the ridge will have to negotiate with him for water by late summer. I know the geography, Dale. I know you know it. I'm telling you the timing. Dale looked toward the house. You're Elsa. She mentioned that she ran into Agnes Kowalski in town. She told me she'd talked to people. Agnes told Martha that your wife spent an hour with her, went over the alderman offer line by line. Dale paused. Martha says Agnes came away from that conversation with a different view of the offer. Silas looked at his neighbor for a moment. What kind of different view? The kind where she understood what she'd actually be signing away, rather than just what the number looked like. Dale shrugged, which on him was a complicated gesture, half admiration and half discomfort, like he hadn't expected to be saying something favorable and didn't quite know how to hold it. I'm just telling you what Martha told me. Your wife made an impression. He rode out 15 minutes later, and Silas stood in the yard for a moment looking east, toward where the Kowalski land sat against the base of the ridge, and thought about Elsa sitting in the post office or the dry goods store or wherever she'd found Agnes Kowalski, going over a legal offer line by line with a woman she'd met once. He went inside. Elsa was at the table mending a tear in one of his work shirts with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. She looked up when he came in. The Kowalski water rights, he said. She set the shirt down. Agnes told you. Dale told me. Agnes told Martha. She nodded once, unsurprised by the chain of information. The offer was misleading. The number was fair, but the terms included a usage restriction clause that would have prevented them from drawing from the East Branch during any period Alderman claimed operational need. In a dry summer, that clause is worth 3 times the purchase price. She said it the same way she said everything, clearly, without drama, as if it were simply the arithmetic of the situation. I thought she should understand what she was agreeing to. You're not a lawyer. No, but I can read a contract. She picked the shirt back up. My first job in Chicago was keeping books for a dry goods importer. He had a lawyer who made sure I understood every document that crossed the desk. I paid attention. Silas sat down across from her. You've never mentioned that. You've never asked about Chicago. She said it without accusation, just the fact of it. He thought about that. She was right. In nearly 2 months, he'd learned what she could do far more than who she was. He'd meant what he told her, that he wanted honesty. But honesty about what she was doing and honesty about who she'd been were different things, and he'd never asked for the second kind. Tell me about it, he said. She looked up from the shirt. Chicago, he said. The importer. How you got there from Saxony. She was quiet for a moment. He thought she might deflect. She had her own habits of privacy, he'd learned, not so different from his in the end. She didn't deflect. She set the shirt down again and told him. Not all of it at once, not in a rush, but in the careful, measured way she described everything. A sentence at a time, each one true. None of them performed. Her father's farm, the drought that lasted 3 years and took everything. Her mother who died of fever when Elsa was 14, which she mentioned in passing and without elaboration, in the tone of someone who's been carrying a weight so long they've stopped noticing the shape of it. The boat from Hamburg. The German neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Her brother Carl, who was 2 years younger and had followed her across because she'd written that there was work. And she was right, there was work, but the work was brutal, and the city was indifferent, and nothing about it was what she'd hoped. Why the agency? Silas asked. She was quiet for a moment. Because I'd been in the city for 7 years, and I was still in the same room I'd rented the second week I arrived, she said. I was working 3 jobs and sending money home, and I was tired. She paused. Not tired of working for nothing that was mine. She looked at the table. The agency was a gamble. I knew it was a gamble. Carl thought I'd lost my mind. Were you afraid? He asked. She looked up. And the expression on her face was the kind that came from genuinely considering whether to answer a question honestly rather than comfortably. Yes, she said. I read your letter of requirements on the train from Chicago to Billings, and I thought, this man wants a piece of furniture that can cook. She said it without rancor, just the truth of what she'd thought. I almost got off in Sheridan. Why didn't you? Because I'd already mailed my resignation to the importer. A pause, and then, quietly, the closest thing to humor he'd heard from her yet about her own situation. And because the alternative was going back to Carl and telling him he was right, and that was worse. He almost smiled. He controlled it, but barely. You would have managed, he said, wherever you ended up. I know. She said it without arrogance. Just the plain certainty of a woman who'd been managing since she was 14 and had made her peace with it. But I didn't want to manage anymore. I wanted something that was mine. She looked around the kitchen, his kitchen, with the 2 cups on the shelf and her rock collection on the windowsill and the coop she'd fixed and the shed she'd reorganized. I think I'm getting that. The way she said it, tentatively, like she wasn't quite willing to let herself be sure, did something to his chest that he wasn't prepared for. Not dramatic, just a kind of shift, like a gear finding its proper place. "You are," he said. She looked at him. "Getting that," he said. "It's yours." She was quiet for long enough that he worried he'd said something wrong. Then she nodded, just once, and picked up the shirt again, and her face did the closed thing it did when she'd received something she needed to sit with alone. He got up and went to see about the evening feed, and when he came back, supper was on the table and she didn't mention it again, and neither did he. 3 days before Christmas, Elsa collapsed. Not dramatically. Not the kind of collapsing that happened in the middle of the yard in plain sight. She was in the storage shed, bringing in the second sack of oats for the morning feed, and she simply sat down on the floor with the sack still in her arms and didn't get up. Silas found her because he noticed the shed door had been open too long. She was sitting against the wall with her eyes closed and her coat pulled tight, and the sack of oats was on the floor beside her, and she was breathing in the shallow, careful way of a person concentrating very hard on an act that should be automatic. "Elsa," her eyes opened. "I'm all right," she said. "You're on the floor." I sat down. "You've been in here 20 minutes. He crouched in front of her and looked at her face, and what he saw tightened something in him he hadn't known was loose. Her face was wrong, not pale, but a particular shade of gray-pink that was worse than pale, and her eyes were glassy in the way that meant fever before the person themselves knew they had one. "How long have you been feeling this way?" "I'm fine." "Elsa." "A few days." She pushed against the wall to stand, and he put a hand on her arm, not forcefully, but decisively. She looked at his hand, then at him. "I can walk." "I know you can." He kept his hand there. "In a minute. How high is the fever?" "I don't know. I don't have a thermometer." "I do. Inside." She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to fight something. He watched her calculate and decide against it, which he understood. She was too tired to fight tonight. "All right," she said. He helped her up. She didn't need much help, but she also didn't refuse what he offered, which told him more than her words did. He got her inside, got her to the chair, got the thermometer from the shelf above the stove where he kept it with the other medical supplies. 103 degrees. He looked at the thermometer for a moment. "It's not that high," she said, reading his face. "It's high enough." He set the thermometer on the table. "You're going to bed." "The morning feed." "I'll do the morning feed." "The South Trough needs Elsa." His voice was quiet. The quiet version that wasn't quiet at all. "I have managed this ranch for 9 years. I know how to do the morning feed." She looked at him. "I know that," she said softly. "I know you do. I don't like being out of use." Something about the phrase, "out of use," like she was a tool, like she'd absorbed the language of utility so completely that it was how she thought about her own body, her own worth. That phrase stayed with him through the whole night and didn't let him go. "You're not out of use," he said. "You're sick. Those are different things." He got her to bed, got extra blankets from the chest in the hall, built the fire in the main room up higher than usual so the heat would reach through the wall. She protested twice more, and he ignored both protests with the same flat patience she used on him when he was being stubborn, which he'd found infuriating from the outside but used without apology from the inside. By 8 o'clock, she was asleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee gone cold and listened to the sound of her breathing through the wall, which was rougher than it should have been, and thought about the nearest doctor. Billings, 42 miles. In December, on roads that might or might not be passable, it was a 3-hour drive minimum, and that assumed the weather held. If the weather didn't hold, and the sky that evening had the particular look of weather that was not going to hold. It was longer, much longer, or not possible at all. He got up, banked the fire, checked on her once more. She was deeply asleep, her hair loose across the pillow, her breathing still rough but steady. He stood in the doorway of her room for longer than he'd intended, long enough that he became aware of how long he was standing there, and made himself go back to the kitchen. He sat down. He thought about what he had. Willow bark, which helped fever. Broth, which she needed but wouldn't be able to make herself. His own 2 hands and whatever knowledge 9 years of frontier life had given him about keeping a person alive through a Montana winter when help was 3 hours away in good weather. He started boiling water. Straseb. The fever climbed on the second day. He knew it had climbed before he took her temperature because she stopped arguing. Elsa argued about everything. She argued from instinct, from principle, from what he was increasingly certain was simply the deep habit of a woman who'd learned that if she didn't fight for her own position, nobody else would. When she stopped arguing, it meant she didn't have the energy to sustain it, which meant the fever was doing something. 104.2. He sat beside her bed on the wooden chair he'd brought from the kitchen and made her drink the willow bark tea, which she hated, and broth, which she accepted, and water, which she fought him on because she said she wasn't thirsty, and he said that was what fever felt like, and she needed to drink anyway. "You're worse at this than I expected," she said on the second evening. Her voice was rough and slow. "Taking care of a person. Am I doing something wrong?" "No." A pause labored. "You're doing everything right. You keep looking at me like I'm going to die." He was quiet. "You're not going to die," he said. "I know." Her eyes were closed. "I've been sicker than this. In Chicago, there was a winter. Carl and I both got it, whatever it was. He was worse than me." She stopped to breathe. "I made him broth." "Did it help?" "Eventually." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. He complained the whole time. I was never more certain that he'd recover. He looked at her face. Gray-pink still, the wrongness in it. But still her face, still entirely itself, still the same face that had stepped off a train in November and told him she didn't meet a single one of his requirements and smiled like that was the beginning of something. "Do you want me to read?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "What?" There's a book. On the shelf." He said it awkwardly because he didn't often say awkward things, and it surprised him. "If you can't sleep, I can read aloud." She looked at him for a long moment with the fever-glassy eyes. "You'd do that?" she said. I offered. "Your voice is—" She stopped. "What?" "Nothing." She closed her eyes again. "Yes. Read. It doesn't matter what." He got the book from the shelf, the soil management book, the only one he owned, which he recognized was not ideal, and opened it and began reading in the flat, careful way of a man who read slowly and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He read about drainage patterns and soil pH and the particular challenges of high-elevation agriculture in northern climates. She didn't say anything. After 15 minutes, he thought she'd fallen asleep and stopped reading, and she said, without opening her eyes, "Keep going." He kept going. He read for 2 hours. His voice gave out before she fell properly asleep, and he sat with the book closed on his knee and listened to her breathe and thought, with a clarity that surprised him like cold water on a warm face, that he was afraid. Not of the work, not of the logistical problem of a sick woman and a ranch that needed running and a doctor 42 miles away. He was afraid in the specific unwelcome way of a person who has allowed something to matter without fully planning for it, who has permitted something to take root before deciding whether the soil was ready. He had not ordered this. He had ordered practicality and obedience and quiet. He had received something else entirely, something that had rearranged his days and his shed and his ledger and his dinner table, and had apparently, without his noticing the specific moment it happened, also rearranged something in himself that he hadn't planned to have rearranged. He sat by her bed through the night. Not the whole night. He got up twice to feed the stove and once to check the animals, because the ranch still needed running regardless of what was happening inside the house. But he came back each time. He didn't examine why. He simply did it, the way he did most things, because it was necessary, because she was his responsibility, because the alternative was sitting in the kitchen with his cold coffee, and that was not something he was willing to do. He told himself it was responsibility. By 3 in the morning, he'd stopped believing that particular story. Though, on the third day, the fever broke. He knew it before she woke up. Her skin had changed color. The wrongness was leaving it, and her breathing had smoothed back out into something that was simply sleep rather than fever sleep. He sat in the kitchen and drank his coffee and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't been aware he was holding until it let go. She woke at 9, which was 3 hours past her usual time. He heard her moving and went to the doorway of her room. She was sitting up in bed with her hair completely loose, blinking at the light with the careful expression of someone feeling out how much each thing hurts. She looked at him, looked at the window. "What time is it?" she said. Her voice was still rough, but the glassiness was gone from her eyes. "Past 9. The animals. Fed. Done. Troughs cleared, south fence is patched where I found the split rail yesterday." He leaned against the door frame. "Sit down." She was already trying to get up. She made it to the edge of the bed and then sat very still for a moment with her hands flat on the mattress. "I stood up too fast," she said. "Yes. I'll be fine in a moment. Take 2 moments. There's no urgency." She looked at him. "You've been up all night," she said. It was not a question. He looked like what he was. A man who'd spent 72 hours running a ranch single-handed while also not sleeping, and there was no version of his face that hid it. "Some of the nights," he said. "Silas. You were sick." "I know I was sick. I don't—" She stopped. The expression on her face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing he'd learned to read as Elsa working out how to receive something she didn't know how to hold. "You didn't have to stay." "No," he said. "I know." She was quiet. "I read to you," he said. "The first night. You probably don't remember." "I remember." Her voice was quiet. "The soil book. It was the only one I had. It was—" She stopped again, looked at her hands for a moment, flat on the mattress. "It was kind." Neither of them said anything for a moment. He had not been called kind in a very long time. He was called capable, reliable, fair when people were being generous. Kind was not a word he'd associated with himself, and hearing it from her, in that particular quiet voice, did something he was not prepared to handle in the doorway of her bedroom at 9 in the morning. "Can you eat?" he asked. "Yes." "I'll make something." He went to the kitchen and made oatmeal and coffee and brought them to her, and she ate slowly and without argument, which was the surest sign she was still not quite well. And he sat across from her at the small table he'd moved into her room and drank his own coffee and watched her eat and didn't pretend he wasn't watching. "The rock's on your windowsill," he said. She looked up. "You've never said where you found them." A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Something that was almost shy, which was not a word he'd have put with Elsa Vogel before today. "Different places on the property," she said. "There's a red one from the east pasture near the seep, a white one from the creek bank, the flat gray one." She stopped, seemed to consider whether to continue. "I found it the first day. When I walked the perimeter, I was looking for things to keep, so I'd have a reason to stay attached." He thought about her on that first day, new here, uncertain despite everything her face showed, picking up a gray rock from his land because she needed reasons. "I didn't know that," he said. "You didn't ask." She said it the same way she'd said it before, about Chicago. Not as an accusation. Just the plain fact that there were things about her he hadn't thought to find out, and she'd been waiting, in her careful way, for him to find them. He looked at the rocks on the windowsill, 6 of them, lined up in a row, each one different. "Show me where you found the red one," he said, "when you're better." She looked at him for a long moment with the gray-green eyes that had gone back to themselves now, sharp and clear and watching. "All right," she said. He went to find Frank Alderman 2 days after Elsa was back on her feet. He didn't tell her he was going. He told her he had business in the East Valley and left early in the morning while she was still reorganizing the storage system she'd been unable to touch for 4 days of fever and was making up for lost time. Alderman's property was larger than it looked from the road. The main house was new, built in the last year, Silas guessed, from lumber that cost more than a frontier homesteader spent without a specific statement being intended. He pulled up in front of it and waited, because he didn't get off his horse until he chose to. Aldermen came out in 3 minutes. "Rowan!" He looked unsurprised. Men who were always making moves expected other people to eventually respond to them. "Come inside." "I won't." Silas stayed on his horse. "I came to tell you one thing. The South Creek access isn't available. Not this spring, not next year, not at any number you're going to offer." Alderman looked up at him with the weighing expression. "That's a strong position for a man who's had a hard month." "I've had fine months." "Your wife's been sick, I heard." He said it without particular menace, but with the deliberate precision of a man letting you know the range of his information. "These are hard years to run a small operation alone." "I'm not alone," Silas said, and the words came out with a flatness that was also, underneath, a statement about something more than the ranch. "And the answer is no, now and going forward." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "The Kowalski family," he said, "may make a different decision. That's their right." Silas took up his reins. "But the Kowalski family also has a clearer understanding of your contract terms than they did 2 weeks ago. You might find the conversation harder." Alderman looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite anger, more like the cold recalibration of a man adjusting his map. "Your wife," he said. "Yes," said Silas. "My wife." He rode home. He got there at midday and Elsa was in the yard, the shed door open, moving something heavy with the focused concentration of a woman who was still not quite fully recovered, but was not about to admit it. He dismounted, tied the horse, and walked over. "Let me take that," he said. She looked at him. "I'm fine." "I know. Let me take it anyway." She stepped aside and let him move the feed sack to where she wanted it and didn't make a comment about it, which was progress. "How was your business in the East Valley?" she asked. He looked at her. "It was fine," he said. She nodded. Her eyes said she knew exactly where he'd been and what he'd done, which he supposed he should have anticipated because she knew the geography and the situation as well as he did. And there was really only one piece of business in the East Valley that required going in person with no advance notice. "Silas," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." He lifted the next feed sack without answering, but she saw his face before he turned away from her, and his face, despite his best efforts over many years, was not as controlled as he believed it to be. She saw what was on it. She went back to work. He went back to work. And the ranch ran on in the cold December air, 2 people moving around the same land without drama or declaration, with the particular efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms so thoroughly that they've stopped noticing where one begins and the other ends. And in that ordinary motion, in those ordinary hours, something that had begun as a transaction was becoming something else entirely. Neither of them naming it yet, both of them knowing it, the way you know, before you're ready to know. The way the ground knows spring is coming long before the first thaw is visible on the surface. Christmas arrived on a Thursday that year, quiet and absolute, the way serious things tended to arrive in Montana, without announcement, without ceremony, simply present when you opened the door in the morning. Silas woke at 4:30, as he always did. He lay still for a moment, listening for the sounds that would tell him what the day intended. Wind, moderate, from the northwest, which meant cold but manageable. No new snow falling. He could tell by the particular silence that came when snow was actively coming down, a hushed deadness to the air that was absent this morning. The fire had held through the night. The pipes were silent, which meant they hadn't frozen. He got up. He went to the kitchen and found it exactly as he'd left it the night before, which meant Elsa wasn't up yet, which meant it was either earlier than usual or she was still recovering ground the fever had taken from her, which she would never admit and he would never say directly because they'd developed over 3 months a working understanding of which truths needed to be spoken and which ones simply needed to be known. He started the stove, put the water on for coffee, stood at the window and looked at the dark yard and the dark barn and the darkness beyond that which was the east pasture, and then the ridge, and then the sky, which was beginning, barely, to separate from the land at the horizon, and the particular gray that came before first light. He heard her door. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her coat already on over her nightclothes, which was standard. The house was cold enough in the first hour of the morning that coats were practical regardless of what was underneath them. Her hair was loose. She stopped when she saw him. "You're up early," she said. "Same time as always. I thought you might sleep in, given the day." He looked at her. "Do I seem like a man who sleeps in on any day?" She almost smiled. "No." She went to the stove and checked the water. "I'll make breakfast." "I was going to sit down, Silas." He sat down. He was doing that more often now, accepting her management of the kitchen the way she accepted his management of the fence line decisions. A quiet division of competence that had evolved without being discussed, and that worked well enough that neither of them saw a reason to examine it. She made eggs and salt pork, and the biscuits she'd been making every morning since the third week, which had become, without either of them deciding it, simply part of what mornings were. He drank his coffee and watched her move around the kitchen with the economy of someone who'd learned the space so completely that she didn't look at what she was doing anymore, just did it, hands knowing where things were the way his hands knew the barn in the dark. "Merry Christmas," she said, setting the plate in front of him. He looked up. She was standing across the table with her own plate, and her expression was the careful neutral she used when she'd offered something and wasn't sure if it would land or be deflected. "Merry Christmas," he said. She sat down. They ate. He found the first thing at mid-morning. He'd been in the barn doing the second feeding when he came back toward the house and saw the wreath on the door. It was small, made from pine branches that had been cut and bent, and tied with a piece of red cloth he recognized as a strip from the hem of an older dress she'd apparently decided to sacrifice. It was not elaborate. It was not particularly neat. The branches were slightly uneven on the right side, and the bow was the kind made by someone who didn't do bows often. But it was on the door, and it had not been there when he went out. He stood in the yard and looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside. She was at the table cutting something, check. More pine branches laid out on the cloth she'd put down to protect the wood. She was making something for the windowsills he could see, small arrangements of branch and dried berry stems she must have gathered and saved weeks ago without his noticing. She didn't look up when he came in. "The wreath," he said. "I know it's crooked." She kept cutting. "I'll fix it later." I wasn't going to say it was crooked. She did look up then, briefly, to check his expression. He kept it even. "The cloth," he said. "Was that from a dress?" "An old one. The hem was gone anyway." She went back to the branches. "I've been gathering things for a few weeks. A little at a time when I was out. I wasn't sure you'd want it, so I didn't say anything. I can take it all down if—" "Leave it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought—" She stopped. Chose different words. "I know this isn't what you're used to. I don't know what Christmas was like here before." He hung his coat, poured himself more coffee, though he didn't need it, stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment, which was something he did sometimes when he needed a second to find the right shape for something. "My mother did greenery," he said, "on the mantel. She saved ribbon all year from whatever came into the house." He stopped. "She died when I was 22. After that, it was just me and my father he wasn't a Christmas man." He turned around. Elsa was watching him with the quiet, focused attention she gave to things that mattered, not staring, just present. "I haven't had greenery in a long time," he said. She nodded. She didn't say anything sentimental. She didn't tell him his mother would have liked this or that. It was going to be different now. She just nodded and went back to her pine branches, and that restraint, the choosing not to make it larger than it was the thing he'd come to value most about her. He sat down at the other end of the table, and after a moment he picked up a branch and began stripping the lower needles the way he could see she was doing, because there was work to be done, and sitting watching someone work was not something he was capable of. She glanced at him, said nothing. They worked at the table together for an hour, and the kitchen filled with the sharp, clean smell of pine, and outside the sky was the color of old pewter and perfectly still. Martha Hutchins arrived at noon with a covered dish and the particular expression of a woman who has been thinking about something for several weeks and has decided that today is the day. Silas saw her coming from the barn and made it to the yard in time to meet her before she reached the door, which he did deliberately, not out of rudeness, but out of the preference for managing which conversations happened where. "Martha," he said. "I brought a ham," she said, handing down the covered dish from the wagon, with the certainty of a woman who never questioned whether her ham would be welcome. "Dale's coming later. We usually spend the afternoon with the Kowalski family, but Agnes is still not well, so—" She climbed down with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd been climbing in and out of wagons her whole life. "I thought you and Elsa might want company. You could have sent word first." "It's Christmas, Silas." She said it with the gentle firmness of someone who understood perfectly well that he would have found a reason to discourage the visit if given advance notice. "Is she inside?" Elsa appeared in the doorway before he could answer, with the wreath still slightly crooked above her head and her hands still faintly sticky with pine sap. "Mrs. Hutchins," she said, "come in." Martha looked at the wreath, looked at Elsa, looked at Silas in a way that communicated 17 different things without a single word, and went inside. Silas stood in the yard for a moment. Then he followed. Martha Hutchins, it turned out, had decided to make up her mind about Elsa today. Silas could see it happening across the kitchen table. Martha was not an unkind woman, but she was a woman with fixed opinions, and her fixed opinion of Elsa for the past 2 months had been peculiar, which she deployed as a category for anything that didn't fit the shape of her experience. But something had shifted. Agnes Kowalski probably, and whatever Agnes had told Martha about the conversation regarding the alderman contract, and Martha was now doing the visible work of revising a position she'd settled into. She asked questions. Not inventory questions this time. Real ones. She asked about Saxony. Had Elsa grown up farming? What did they grow? What was the land like? She asked about Chicago. What parts of the city? What kind of work? She asked about the crossing from Hamburg, and Elsa answered everything in the same direct way she answered everything, and Martha listened in the way she rarely listened, which was without waiting for her turn to speak. "You came alone?" Martha asked. "On the ship." "With my brother, but he was 17 and I was 19, so alone enough." Martha was quiet for a moment. She was 53 years old and had crossed 4 states with her husband in a wagon when she was 26, which was its own kind of journey, and something in the recognition of that passed across her face. "Dale thought this arrangement wouldn't last," she said. Not cruelty, just Martha's way of putting things directly, which Silas actually respected even when it was inconvenient. "I know," Elsa said. "He still thinks it. He won't say it today because it's Christmas, but he thinks it." "What do you think?" Elsa asked. Martha looked at her. Then she looked at Silas, and he made the mistake of not controlling his face fast enough, and whatever she saw there made her pick up her coffee cup and drink from it to cover the thing that happened to her expression. "I think," she said carefully, "that Dale has been wrong before." Elsa looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hutchins." "Martha." A pause. "Martha." Martha nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something had been settled, and asked if Elsa needed more baking soda because she'd brought extra from town. And the conversation moved on into the ordinary afternoon. And Silas sat at his own table drinking coffee that Elsa had made and listening to his wife and his nearest neighbor talk about bread and ground conditions and the Kowalski children's names, and felt, quietly, privately, without any inclination to examine it too closely, something that was simply contentment, which was not a feeling he had much practice with, and which sat in his chest with the slight awkwardness of something trying to find its proper place. Dale arrived at 2 o'clock and sat across from Silas with the particular discomfort of a man who'd said things he now wasn't sure about. They talked about the weather, they talked about the spring planting schedule, and what the winter had done to the roads, and whether the county was going to do anything about the bridge on the East Fork, which had been a problem for 3 years and had apparently decided to continue being a problem. Dale didn't mention the arrangement, didn't mention Elsa specifically, except to say, once, looking at the windowsill arrangement she'd finished that morning, "She's made the place look different." "Yes," Silas said. "Martha said she was sick last week." "She's recovered." "Good." Dale turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You managed all right? The ranch while she was—" "I managed." Dale nodded. Then he said, "And it cost him something. Silas could see it costing him. Kowalski didn't sign with aldermen. Silas looked at him. Emil told me last week. Said Agnes wanted to wait. Said she had some new information about the contract terms. He paused. Alderman's not happy. No, Silas said. I don't imagine he is. Dale looked toward the kitchen, where the sound of Martha and Elsa talking had taken on the rhythm of a real conversation rather than an interview. He looked back at Silas. She's not what I expected, he said. Second time he'd said that, same words. But the thing underneath the words was different this time. Not I don't understand her, more like I was wrong about what I was evaluating. No, Silas said, she's not. Dale nodded slowly, and they sat with that for a moment. Two men who didn't speak easily about the things that mattered, sitting in a warm kitchen on Christmas afternoon, while outside the light went gold and flat across the snow. The Hutchinses left at 4, and the house went quiet again. Silas went to feed the animals, as he did every day at 4, routine being the architecture of his life. And when he came back, Elsa was in the kitchen and something had changed. He noticed it immediately the way he'd learned to notice things about the house, the particular quality of the air, what was on the table, what sounds were coming from where. She'd lit candles, not many, 3, placed on the windowsill alongside her rock collection. And the table had been set differently. The cloth she usually kept folded on the shelf was laid out flat, and there were 2 plates already placed with the particular precision she used when she wanted something to look considered rather than accidental. She was at the stove with her back to him. He stood in the doorway. I know it's not much, she said without turning. She always knew when he came in. But I had the candles from the box in the supply shed. They were going to sit there all winter anyway, and the cloth was... I just thought, Elsa. She turned. He looked at the table, at the candles on the windowsill next to the rocks she'd gathered from his land, because she'd needed reasons to stay attached, at the biscuits she'd apparently made a second batch of, still warm by the smell. It's fine, he said, and then because fine was not the right word and he knew it and she would know it. It's good, it looks good. Something in her face did the thing it sometimes did. The thing he'd spent months trying to name and had finally understood was simply relief. Not happiness exactly, though it was adjacent to that. Relief. The specific feeling of a person who has been uncertain about their welcome and discovered, again, that they are welcome. Sit down, she said. Supper's almost ready. He sat down. She brought the food and sat across from him, and they ate by candlelight on Christmas evening in a kitchen that had, over the past 3 months, accumulated the evidence of 2 people living in it. Her rocks, his ledger on the shelf, the 2 cups that were always on the counter now, the coupe she'd fixed visible through the window, the wreath still slightly crooked on the front door. The biscuits are better than yesterday's, he said. She looked up. I added more butter, she said. I've been trying to get the ratio right. What was wrong with the original ratio? Nothing was wrong with it. I thought it could be better. He looked at her. She was eating with her usual focused attention, not performing conversation, just being at the table the way she always was. Present, direct, entirely herself. Of course you did, he said. She glanced up and caught his expression, and the thing that crossed her face this time was not quite a smile, but close enough that it didn't matter. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the last of the day's light was leaving, and the candles on the windowsill caught the dark coming on and held it off in a small, warm circle. Tell me about Christmas when you were young, he said. She looked up again, surprised by the question. He asked questions rarely, and when he did, they were usually practical. This wasn't practical. In Saxony, she said. Yes? She was quiet for a moment, going somewhere in her memory. My mother made... There was a bread, sweet, with dried fruit. She made it weeks before and wrapped it in cloth, and we weren't allowed to touch it until Christmas morning. She paused. It never tasted as good as it smelled while it was baking, but we waited for it every year the same. She looked at the candle on the windowsill. She sang, my mother. She had a low voice, not particularly musical, but she sang anyway. Old songs she'd learned from her own mother. I don't remember the words anymore, just the sound. He listened. Your turn, she said. He wasn't expecting that. He didn't often talk about his childhood, not because it had been unhappy, but because the habit of keeping things inside was so old, it had become structural, part of how he was built. "My mother's greenery," he said. "I told you about that." "Yes. What else?" He thought. "She made my father read aloud," he said. "Every Christmas evening. He hated it. He was worse at reading than I am, and that's saying something. But she insisted every year. She'd pick the book, and he'd sit in the chair by the fire and read in that voice he had, like every sentence was costing him money." He stopped. The memory was more vivid than he'd expected. Suddenly, there in full detail, his father's large, rough hands around the book, his mother's expression of contained amusement, the fire, the particular smell of the room. "I didn't think about it until you asked. I haven't thought about it in years." Elsa was watching him. "He read to you," she said carefully, "when you were reading to me. Were you thinking of him?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, and then honestly, "Maybe." She nodded, didn't push further. That was a particular quality of hers he'd come to rely on without realizing it, knowing when to stop, when a thing had been said sufficiently and didn't need to be excavated further. They finished supper. He helped clear the table, which he'd started doing 3 weeks ago without deciding to. Just one day picking up his plate and bringing it to the basin, and continuing to do it because there was no good reason not to. She washed, he dried. They worked side by side at the counter in the candlelight, quiet, and the house was warm, and outside the Montana winter was doing what it did, and none of it was touching them in here, in this kitchen, on this Christmas evening. He hung up the cloth. He said, "I'm going to check the animals one more time before bed." "I know," she said. He put his coat on. At the door he stopped, and he wasn't sure why. Some instinct, some small resistance to simply leaving the room the way he always left rooms, without remark. "Elsa." She turned from the basin. He didn't have a prepared thing to say. He'd stopped at the door without a plan, which was unlike him. "Thank you," he said. "For the greenery, the candles." He stopped. "For all of it." She looked at him with the gray-green eyes and the expression that was not performing anything. "You're welcome," she said, quietly, simply. He went outside. January came in hard. The cold that arrived after Christmas was a different category of cold, the kind that didn't allow for error, that punished inattention and rewarded only those who had prepared correctly and completely. Silas had prepared correctly and completely, as he always did, and still the January of that year tested him in ways that January usually didn't. 3 cattle in the north pasture had to be moved at 2 in the morning during a sudden temperature drop that cracked the water trough and rendered the north shelter dangerously cold. He was out there in the dark moving animals by lantern light, and Elsa was beside him because she'd heard him get up and had simply gotten up herself and come without being asked and without making a point of it. They worked in the brutal cold for 90 minutes without speaking except when the work required it. She knew what she was doing, she always knew what she was doing, and he handed her the rope for the second heifer without looking, and she took it without looking, and they moved the animals and reinforced the south shelter and broke the ice from the secondary trough and came inside at 4 in the morning, cold enough that their hands were shaking. She went straight to the stove. He sat at the table and let himself sit, which was something he didn't usually allow. Sitting when there was more work possible. Sitting when the day wasn't done. But it was 4 in the morning in January, and his hands were shaking and the cattle were moved and the shelter was reinforced, and sitting was simply what his body was doing. She put coffee in front of him. She sat down across from him with her own cup, and they sat in the kitchen in the pre-dawn cold and drank their coffee, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "The second heifer," he said finally. She was reluctant. She always is. She needs to see the others moving first. Elsa wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've started giving her the feed with the extra oats in the evening. She's calmer with a full stomach." He looked at her. "When did you start doing that?" 3 weeks ago." She looked at her coffee. "I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" A pause. "Because I thought you'd say you'd been feeding that heifer the same way for 9 years, and it had been fine." He thought about that. Would I have been wrong? She asked. Honestly, probably not. Then I should have said something anyway. She was quiet. I'm still doing that, deciding what you're ready to hear before I say it. I know it's not right. He looked at the table, at his hands around the coffee cup, still cold, the feeling coming back slowly. I make it hard, he said. Sometimes. She met his eyes. Less than you used to. He nodded. Tell me things, he said. Don't decide first. Just tell me. She looked at him for a moment. All right. Even when you think I'll push back. Especially then, she said, and the faintest humor was in her voice, the dry kind that she deployed rarely, and that landed every time. He almost smiled. Got most of the way there. They drank their coffee. It was the third week of January when Silas understood that the arrangement had become something else, and the understanding came not from a conversation or a dramatic moment, but from a Tuesday afternoon so ordinary it was almost embarrassing. He'd come in from the west fence to find her at the table with the ledger open in front of her, his ledger, which she now looked at with his full knowledge and occasional active invitation, and beside it a letter she was writing to the seed supplier in Billings about the spring oat order, adjusting the quantities based on the rotation plan she'd proposed in December and that he'd agreed to implement. She was writing the letter in his name, not because she'd decided to, because he'd asked her to last week when he'd said he had too much to deal with, and she'd said she could handle the seed correspondence if he told her the numbers, and he'd said yes without thinking about it too much, and then gone back to work. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her write his letter on his behalf to his supplier about his land, and he thought, this is not what I ordered. He'd ordered practicality, obedience, efficiency, a working body to share the labor. He had not ordered someone who knew his heifer preferred extra oats in the evening, someone who could read a contract and protect a neighbor he'd never met, someone who gathered rocks from his pasture because she needed reasons to stay, someone who made the house smell like pine on Christmas morning and sat across the table at 4 a.m. in January and told him, without apology and without cruelty, that she was still learning how to trust him with everything she noticed. He had not ordered someone who made him want to be worth trusting. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. Not that she would change the house, or the shed, or the cattle rotation. That she would change something in him. That 38 years of being entirely sufficient to himself would turn out to have left a specific shape of absence in him that he hadn't known was there until she walked into it and started, in her efficient, unsentimental, entirely Elsa way, filling it. She looked up. The oat order, she said. Do you want me to add a buffer for the north field? I think we underprojected. He walked across the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and said, Show me. She turned the ledger to face him and explained, pointing at the numbers. And he leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at what she was showing him, and they were close enough that he could see the detail of the numbers clearly, close enough that he was aware of her presence beside the numbers, and he made himself look at the numbers and concentrate on what she was saying. The buffer makes sense, he said when she finished. I thought so. Add it. She wrote the number. He watched her handwriting go across the page, smaller than his, precise, slightly slanted to the right, and thought about the letter she'd been half writing to the agency on a night in December, the contingency plan, the name of the families on the south side of Chicago who needed domestic help. Elsa, he said. She finished the number, looked up. He'd had things he meant to say, things he'd been turning over for weeks without finding the right shape for them. He was not a man who spoke easily about the internal architecture of himself, had never been, and wasn't going to suddenly become one. But there were things that needed saying, and he was going to say them the only way he knew how, plainly, without decoration, and trusting her to understand what the plainness cost him. I know I'm difficult, he said. She waited. I know the first weeks were... I wasn't... He stopped, found another way in. I had a list of requirements. You've heard about that list. What I don't think I've told you is why. He looked at the ledger, at his father's name on the inside cover. My father had this ranch, lost it, as I told you. Bought it back. Spent 20 years being proud of having bought it back, and then He had a partner for the last 3 years before he died. A man who seemed right for the land. Good worker, good instincts. My father trusted him with everything. He stopped. He borrowed against the property without my father knowing. When I found out, there was almost nothing left to inherit. Elsa was very still. The requirements, he said. The list, 12 items. None of them had anything to do with what I actually needed. They were armor. He said the word like it cost him. I wanted someone who would never surprise me, never do anything I hadn't accounted for, someone I could see all the way through. He looked at her. You're the opposite of that. You've surprised me every single day since you stepped off that train. She held his gaze. Is that still a problem? She asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. She absorbed that. He could see her taking it in, checking it against the weight of everything that had come before it, testing it the way she tested ground before she walked on it. The letter you wrote to the agency, she said carefully, in December. You said the arrangement was continuing. Yes. Is that still what you want? He thought about what he actually wanted, which was not something he'd allowed himself to examine directly for many years because wanting things without sufficient control over their outcome was a kind of vulnerability he'd spent a long time sealing off. I want you to stay, he said, not because the ranch needs managing, because... He stopped. Because the house is different with you in it. Because I am different. He said it flatly, the way he said things that cost him most. I don't think I would have said that a month ago. No, she said softly. You wouldn't have. Is that what you want? To stay? She looked at the ledger, at the rocks on the windowsill, at the 2 cups on the counter shelf. She looked at all the small evidence of the life that had accumulated in this kitchen over 3 months, the ordinary and unheroic evidence of 2 people becoming necessary to each other. Yes, she said, simply, just that. He nodded. Outside, the January wind moved hard along the north wall of the house, the same wind that had been there every night since December, that he'd spent years listening to from the other side of these walls alone. It was the same sound. It had not changed. But the room had changed, and he had changed, and she was sitting across the table from him in the candlelight of an ordinary January evening, and the ledger was open between them, and the spring oat order was going to have a buffer on the north field, and that was enough. More than enough, more than he'd known to ask for, more than any list of 12 requirements had been capable of containing. He picked up his pencil. Show me the north field numbers again, he said. She turned the ledger back and pointed, and they worked at the table as the wind moved outside and the candles held against the dark. And the house was warm, and neither of them said anything more about what had just passed between them, because some things, once spoken plainly, don't need to be spoken again. They simply become part of the ground you stand on, solid and reliable, the kind of ground that holds even when the weather doesn't. The spring oat order arrived in March with the buffer Elsa had added, and the north field that year produced more than it ever had. Silas didn't mention it directly. He wasn't that kind of man. But one evening in late April, when the first green was coming through in the east pasture and the light was staying longer each day, he came in from the field and set a handful of young oat shoots on the table in front of her without a word. She looked at them, looked at him. North field, he said. I see that. He hung up his coat and washed his hands and sat down for supper, and she gathered up the shoots and put them in the cup on the windowsill between 2 of her rocks, and that was the entire conversation, and it was enough. The wedding happened in February, 6 weeks after the January evening when they'd told each other the truth at the kitchen table over an oat order. It was not a large wedding. It was not a small one either, exactly. It was simply what was possible, given who they were and where they were, and the fact that neither of them had ever been people who needed a thing to be large in order for it to matter. The justice of the peace came from Billings on a Tuesday, a thin older man named Hargrove, who'd married more frontier couples than he could count and had developed, over the decades, the exact right tone for the occasion, formal without being stiff, brief without being dismissive. Martha and Dale Hutchins were there. Emil Kowalski came, without Agnes, who was still recovering, But he stood in the back of the room with his hat in his hands and his expression of a man who understood that some events were worth witnessing. Carl Vogel was not there. He was in Chicago, too far and too little money for the trip, which Elsa had told Silas matter-of-factly in January when they'd discussed the logistics. She'd written to Carl, and he had written back. Silas had not read the letter, but he saw her face after she read it, the small, careful set of her jaw that meant she was managing something. Was he angry? Silas had asked. No. She'd folded the letter. He said he hoped I knew what I was doing. Do you? She'd looked at him with the gray-green eyes and said, better than he does. So Carl wasn't there, and that was a gap, and Elsa carried it quietly the way she carried most things. Not visibly, but present underneath everything. The specific weight of a person you love, not being in the room for something important. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything about it before the ceremony. But afterward, when Hargrove had gone and the Hutchinses were eating the cake Martha had brought, and Emil Kowalski was talking to Dale about the east fence problem, Silas found Elsa standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the yard. He stood beside her. We'll get Carl out here, he said. Summer. When the roads are better and the work lightens, we'll send him money for the ticket. She turned to look at him. He can stay in the extra room, Silas said. I'll build the bunk out. It won't take long. She was quiet for a moment. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to. She looked at him with the expression she got when she was adjusting her understanding of something, recalibrating, the way she recalibrated everything, efficiently and without drama. He'll probably argue with you about everything, she said. He's like that. I know someone else like that. The corner of her mouth moved. He means well. I know that too. She looked back out the window at the yard, at the land that was hers now in every sense of the word, officially and completely, the land she'd gathered rocks from in the first days because she needed reasons to stay attached. Thank you, she said. Not a big thank you, a quiet one, the kind that meant something specific rather than everything in general. He drank his coffee. Martha called from the table that the cake was getting eaten without them, and Elsa turned from the window and went back to the room, and Silas followed, and that was February. Spring on the Rowan Ranch that year was different from every spring before it. Not because the work was different. The work was what it always was, relentless and specific, and tied to the rhythm of the land in ways that didn't care what had happened to the people doing it over the winter. Fences needed checking after the freeze. The South Creek needed clearing of the debris that had accumulated. The east pasture rotation needed to begin on time, or the grass wouldn't recover before summer. What was different was how the work happened. For 9 years, Silas had done the morning run-through in his head every night before sleep. A private inventory, what needed doing, and in what order, and what could wait, and what couldn't. He'd done it alone, revised it alone, acted on it alone. The ranch had functioned well because of this. He was not a man who needed to be told he was capable. Now he did the inventory at the kitchen table. Not every night, not formally. But 2 or 3 evenings a week he'd lay out what he was thinking, and Elsa would listen and push back on things that needed pushing back on and agree with things that were right, and occasionally say something that reordered the whole picture in a way that was simply better, and the work that came out of those evenings was better work than he'd done alone. He didn't announce this. He didn't need to. They both knew it. What he noticed privately was how much of his original system had been built around the assumption of limitation. He'd organized the ranch for one person, which meant everything was arranged to minimize dependence on anything he couldn't control alone. 2 people changed that math entirely. He could take the longer fence line because she was handling the animals. She could assess the creek situation because he was reinforcing the north shelter. Problems he'd been managing by triage for years, this one can wait because that one can't, stopped being triage problems and became simply problems, which were solvable. She noticed the shift too. You're sleeping better, she said one morning in April, not looking up from the bread she was making. How do you know how I'm sleeping? Because you were up 3 times a night most of last winter, and now you're not. She folded the dough. I hear things. He thought about that. The walls are thin. Yes. She looked up briefly. You were carrying too much alone. You're not doing that now. He could have disputed it. He chose not to. Neither are you, he said. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the dough. No, she said. I'm not. What? Frank Alderman made one more attempt in April. He came alone this time, without Cree, which was either a concession or a calculation. Silas wasn't sure which. He came in the late afternoon when the light was going gold across the west pasture, and he sat on his horse in the yard and waited, which was different from his last visit when he'd invited Silas inside. Silas came out of the barn and walked to the yard fence and stopped. Rowan, Alderman said. Alderman. A pause. Alderman looked at the house, then back. I want to make one more offer. A fair one. Not the same terms as before. I've adjusted the contract. The answer is still no. You haven't heard the number. It doesn't matter. Alderman was quiet for a moment, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been certain of something for a long time and is beginning, reluctantly, to revise the certainty. I heard the Kowalski family is staying put. Yes. That was your wife. That was information she shared with Agnes Kowalski. Yes. Alderman looked at the house again. Something moved through his expression that Silas couldn't fully read. Not quite anger, not quite respect, somewhere between the two in the territory that men occupied when they'd been outmaneuvered by someone they hadn't adequately accounted for. She's not what I expected, he said. No, Silas said, for the third time in 6 months, to the third different person. She's not. Alderman nodded once. He took up his reins. The offer stands, he said, in case circumstances change. Circumstances won't change, Silas said, but I'll remember you said it. Alderman rode east. Silas stood in the yard and watched him go and felt not triumph, because triumph was for people who'd been uncertain about the outcome, and he hadn't been uncertain, not about this, simply the satisfaction of a decision made correctly and held to. He went inside. Elsa was at the table with the seed records. She looked up. Alderman, she said. Not a question. Gone. Final visit, I think. She nodded, then carefully, he's not a bad man. Silas looked at her. He's tried to manipulate 3 families out of their water rights. I know, I'm saying he's not bad. I'm not saying he's right. She went back to the records. Men who grew up being the biggest thing in the room often don't know how to stop expanding. It's a limitation, not a character flaw. He sat down across from her. That's a charitable reading. It's an accurate one. She didn't look up. The difference matters. Bad men need to be stopped. Limited men sometimes just need someone to hold the line, and they adjust. She paused. You held the line. He'll adjust. He looked at her across the table. This woman he'd ordered from a Chicago agency with a list of 12 requirements she didn't meet, who had opinions about his neighbor's character that were more nuanced than his own, who went over legal contracts with farmers' wives she'd met once and gathered rocks from the east pasture and woke at 4 a.m. without complaint, and had been, since February, his wife in every legal and actual sense. You're a peculiar person, he said. She looked up, startled. Martha's word, he said. I always thought it was wrong. I couldn't find the right one. She waited. Uncommon, he said. That's closer. She held his gaze for a moment. So are you, she said quietly. He picked up the seed record she'd set down and looked at the numbers she'd been working through, and they spent the next hour on the spring planting decisions, and outside the April light stretched long across the land, and neither of them said anything more about it, which was how they handled most things that mattered. Carl Vogel arrived in June on a Thursday afternoon on the same train from Chicago that Elsa had arrived on 8 months before. He was 28, 2 inches shorter than his sister, with the same direct gray-green eyes and the particular Vogel quality of looking at a room as if calculating what needed improving. He climbed off the train with a single bag and shook Silas's hand and said, in accented English that was somewhat rougher than Elsa's, "She wrote that you are difficult." Silas looked at him. "She also wrote that you are worth it," Carl added. "I am still deciding." "Take your time," Silas said, and loaded the bag into the wagon. Carl spent 3 weeks on the ranch. He argued with Silas about the cattle rotation on the second day. which Silas handled by listening to the argument and then explaining his reasoning and watching Carl's expression shift from opposition to reluctant agreement. He argued with Elsa about the bread recipe on the fourth day, which Elsa handled by saying, "You're wrong," and leaving the kitchen, which apparently was also a Vogel family tradition because Carl looked unsurprised and went back to eating. He worked hard. That was the thing Silas noticed first and kept noticing. Carl worked the way Elsa worked, with the same focused efficiency, the same complete attention to whatever was in front of him. He didn't complain. He asked questions that revealed he was actually thinking about the answers. He was, Silas concluded by the end of the first week, exactly what he'd expected from a man who'd followed his 19-year-old sister across an ocean because she'd said there was work. On the second Thursday evening, Carl sat at the kitchen table after supper. Elsa had gone to check the animals, her own evening habit now, and looked at Silas with the direct Vogel look. "She's different," he said. "From Chicago?" "From before Chicago, from Saxony even, from all of it." Carl turned his coffee cup in his hands. "In Chicago, she was working so hard she didn't have time to become anything. She was just surviving, moving forward." He paused. "Here she's settled." Silas looked at the windowsill. 7 rocks now. She'd added 1 from the creek bank in March. "She chose to be," he said. "I know." Carl was quiet for a moment. "I thought you'd be wrong for her. I told her so." "I know. She told me." "You were both—" Carl stopped, searching for the English. "Not obvious. As a match. Not obvious at all." "No. But she's happy." Silas looked at the door where Elsa would come back through in 10 minutes with the cold still on her coat and whatever she'd observed about the animals that he'd need to know about. She'd tell him before she even took her coat off, because that was how she was. The information came first, the physical comfort second. She'd been built that way by a life that hadn't offered much room for the reverse order. "I think so," Silas said. "You'd have to ask her." "I did," Carl said. "This morning." "What did she say?" Carl almost smiled. The same almost smile as his sister, held back in the same way, by the same habit. "She said yes," he said. "And then she told me to stop asking about her feelings and help her with the south fence." Silas nodded. "That sounds right," he said. Carl left on a Sunday with the money for his ticket home in his pocket. Silas had pressed it on him over 2 days of refusal before Carl finally accepted it with the grace of a man who understood that some things were offered because the person offering them needed to offer, not because the receiver necessarily needed to take. At the wagon, Carl shook Silas's hand a second time. The handshake was different from the first one, firmer, longer. "I was wrong about you," he said. "You didn't know me." "No, but I was wrong anyway." He looked at Elsa, who was standing beside Silas with her arms crossed against the morning cold. He said something to her in German, short, 2 sentences, and she answered in German 1 sentence, and something moved through Carl's face that was not quite tears, but was the territory adjacent to them, the territory that men from hard backgrounds occupied when emotion found them in public, and they weren't sure what to do with it. He got on the wagon. He drove away east toward Billings and the train, and Elsa watched until the wagon was small and then not visible, and Silas stood beside her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and she didn't need filling silence, had never needed that. After a while she said, "He told me I chose well." "Did he?" "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "I know. You're the same way." She turned to look at him, slightly surprised, the way she still sometimes got slightly surprised when he said something observational about her. 8 months in, she still hadn't fully adjusted to being seen. He thought that was something he could spend a long time working on. "Come on," he said. "South fence needs the second post replaced." "I know. I've been saying so for a week." "You have," he agreed, and they went to work. The years that followed were not easy years. That should be said plainly, because the alternative is to let time compress into something falsely smooth, and these were not smooth years. The drought that hit the valley in the summer 2 years after the wedding was the worst in 20 years, and it cost them 2 cattle and 1 full season of the east pasture and a level of anxiety that sat in the house for 8 months like a third occupant, quiet but always present. They got through it. They got through it because Elsa had built a reserve fund into the spring budget every year since their first January together. Small amounts that seemed like nothing in good seasons, and turned out to be the difference between manageable and catastrophic in a bad one. She'd done it without drama, the same way she did everything, just incorporated it into the numbers until Silas stopped questioning it and started thinking of it as simply how ranches were run. They got through it because Silas knew the land well enough to read it in the early spring before the drought was confirmed, and moved the cattle rotation 3 weeks early based on what the soil was telling him, which was the accumulated knowledge of 15 years on this specific ground, and which saved the south pasture enough to carry them through August. They got through it because they were 2 people and not 1, which in hard seasons is the difference that matters most, and that no list of requirements had ever been designed to account for. The Hutchins family lost 200 acres to debt that same drought year. Emil Kowalski sold his timber rights but kept his water access, and Agnes Kowalski sent Elsa a jar of preserved plums in October with a note that said only thank you for last winter, which referred to a conversation about a contract that had happened almost 2 years before, which was the way debt worked in small communities. Slowly, and then remembered all at once, Frank Alderman did not buy either of their properties. He bought elsewhere, expanded elsewhere, and became the kind of presence in the valley that everyone accommodated without particularly liking. He and Silas developed a cold functional civility over the years, the kind that exists between people who have established their positions relative to each other and have decided that maintaining the boundary is more useful than maintaining the conflict. Elsa and Alderman spoke exactly twice at community events, both times about weather, both times with the particular politeness of people who understood each other without any illusions. The ranch grew, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about how a frontier homestead expanded. It happened acre by acre, season by season, through decisions that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong and corrected the following year. They added the northeast parcel in the 3rd year, which gave them access to a second water source and eliminated the single point of vulnerability that Alderman had been leveraging. They built a proper barn in the 5th year, bigger than the original, with a hay storage section that Elsa had designed on paper and Silas had looked at for 3 days before saying the load-bearing wall needed to shift 6 inches east, which she'd agreed with, which was the kind of collaboration they'd built between them. Her vision, his ground-level knowledge, neither of them pretending the other's contribution was unnecessary. Children came. The first was a girl, born in the spring of the 3rd year, with Silas's dark coloring and Elsa's direct gray-green eyes, and the disposition, evident from approximately the 2nd week, of a person who was going to have opinions about everything and express them without apology. They named her Anna, which had been Silas's mother's name, and which Elsa had suggested without Silas asking, because she'd been paying attention to that fact since he'd told her about the greenery on the mantel. He hadn't been able to speak for a moment when she suggested it. "If you'd rather not," she'd said. "No," he'd said. "Anna, yes." The second was a boy, 2 years after Anna, who looked like Carl Vogel and who had, from very early, the particular quality of patience that manifested in some children as wisdom and in others as stubbornness, and in this boy seemed to be both simultaneously. They named him Peter, after nobody in particular, just because it was the name they both said aloud in the same week independently and took it as a sign that some things were simply self-evident. Carl came back for Anna's birth and stayed 6 weeks and argued with Silas about the barn design and was right about 2 things and wrong about 1, which Silas acknowledged with the same reluctant shift of expression Carl used when he was wrong, which suggested the Vogels had come by that particular quality honestly. Martha Hutchins held Anna at the christening and cried, which surprised everyone, including Martha. "I'm not sentimental," she told Elsa afterward, as if clarifying a factual error. "I know," Elsa said. "It happens anyway sometimes." Martha looked at her, looked at Silas across the room, holding the baby with the careful stiffness of a man who was terrified of doing it wrong and covering it with concentration. "He's better than I thought he'd be," Martha said. "He always was," Elsa said. "He just needed someone to be certain of him long enough for him to be certain of himself." Martha was quiet. "That's harder to do than it sounds," she said finally. "Yes," Elsa agreed. It is dead. 10 years after the train from Chicago, the Rowan Ranch was the largest single-family operation in the south part of the Yellowstone Valley. That was not the interesting part. The interesting part was that people came to Silas and Elsa about things that had nothing to do with acreage or cattle or water rights. The Peterson family, who'd sold to aldermen under pressure in the early years, came back through on their way to a new claim farther north and stopped for 2 days. And the conversations that happened at that kitchen table over those 2 days were about contracts and land rights and how to read an offer before you signed it. A young couple who'd taken a homestead claim 8 miles south came the following spring with questions about crop rotation and water trough management and whether the east branch of the creek ran reliable in August. Elsa answered all of it. Silas answered all of it. Sometimes they answered it together, completing each other's sentences in the seamless way of people who have spent enough years thinking alongside each other that the boundary between their knowledge has become permeable. Word spread the way words spread in small communities. Not fast, but durably. The Rowan place was somewhere you could go with a problem. The woman there would read your contract, and the man there knew the land, and between the two of them, something useful was likely to happen. That reputation was built on nothing dramatic. It was built on Elsa telling Agnes Kowalski the truth about a contract on a winter afternoon. It was built on Silas holding a fence line when holding it was the right thing to do. It was built on the ordinary accumulation of correct decisions made by two people who were honest with each other and with the world around them, which sounds simple and is in fact the hardest thing there is. One evening in October, 10 years and 8 months after Elsa stepped off the train in Billings with her own bag in her hand and her list of requirements she didn't meet, she stood at the kitchen window after supper and looked out at the yard. Anna was in the barn, doing the evening feed with the focused competence of a 9-year-old who'd been helping with animals since she could walk. Peter was asleep. Silas was at the table behind her, going over the ledger, the same leather-bound ledger his father had kept, which was nearly full now and would need a second volume before the year was out. The rock collection on the windowsill had grown to 11. She'd added a dark one from the northwest corner of the expanded property when they'd acquired the Peterson parcel, a flat white one from the New Creek Bank, a small reddish piece of shale that Anna had brought her from the South Ridge, because Anna had grown up watching her mother pick up rocks and had simply absorbed the habit without knowing why. She looked at the rocks and at the yard and at the last of the October light going off the land, and she thought about a train platform in November 10 years ago, and a woman who had stood in the doorway of a second-class car and looked at a man on a platform with a hat in his hands and thought, "This is a mistake," and got off the train anyway. "The Peterson parcel east fence," Silas said from the table. "I'm putting it in the spring budget. We've delayed it 2 seasons. "I know. I already put it in." A pause. "When?" "Last week." He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that meant he was deciding whether to be exasperated or amused and landing where he usually landed now, which was somewhere between the two and closer to amused than he would have predicted for himself 10 years ago. "You could tell me," he said. "You could look at the budget before the last week of October." "Elsa." "Silas." She turned from the window. He was looking at her over the ledger with the expression she knew completely now. All of his expressions, had spent 10 years learning them in the same quiet way she'd learned everything, incrementally and without announcement. This one was the one that meant he was not actually irritated, was in fact the opposite, and was covering it with the habit of a man who'd spent too many years alone to lose the habit entirely. "I put a note on the line item," she said, more gently. "In the margin." He looked down at the ledger, found the note, read it, looked back up. "In parentheses," he said, "I didn't want to take up too much space." He looked at her for a long moment with the gray eyes she'd spent 10 years reading that had seemed opaque to her on a November train platform and turned out to be simply careful. A man who'd learned caution as survival and unlearned it slowly, in her presence, over years. "Come look at the spring numbers," he said. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and he turned the ledger to face her, and they went through the spring budget the way they went through everything. So, together, line by line, each of them seeing different things in the same numbers, each of them necessary to what the other missed. Anna came in from the barn and reported that the black-faced heifer, There was always a black-faced heifer on this ranch. They seemed to reproduce that trait specifically, was favoring her right front again. I know, Elsa said. Extra oats in the evening. She's always been like that. Anna accepted this as she accepted most things her mother said about animals, which was completely, and went to wash up for bed. And Silas watched his daughter leave the room and then looked across the ledger at his wife. She was writing something in the margin. Another note, probably, about the spring rotation or the fence materials or some other thing she'd been calculating quietly in the back of her mind while doing 3 other things simultaneously. He looked at her. He thought about a letter he'd written at a kitchen table 9 years ago, 3 drafts because his handwriting was poor and his spelling was worse, describing himself to a matrimonial agency in Chicago. Hard-working, obedient, practical, quiet, preferably between the ages of 22 and 28, not prone to complaints or unnecessary sentiment. He thought about what he'd actually needed, which he hadn't known to write down because you can only write down what you already understand, and the things you most need are often precisely the things you haven't understood yet. He'd needed someone who would tell him the truth, someone who would stay in a difficult situation long enough to let it become something better, someone who would gather rocks from his land in the first days because they needed reasons to stay attached, which was the bravest and most quietly human thing he'd ever heard of a person doing. He'd needed someone uncommon. He'd gotten that. Elsa, he said. She looked up from the margin. He didn't have anything particular to say. He'd called her name the way he sometimes did, not because there was a sentence ready on the other end, but because he wanted her attention, which was a thing he'd been wanting consistently for 10 years and had stopped being embarrassed about. She waited. The North Field buffer, he said. Every year. She tilted her head slightly. What about it? You were right, the first time you suggested it. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I know you know. I'm telling you I know. She held his gaze. Thank you, she said. Not a small thank you, not a large one. The precise size of what it was, but an acknowledgement received and understood. Outside, the October dark had come fully down over the Montana land, over the East Pasture and the South Creek and the Northwest Parcel and all 260 acres of the Rowan Ranch, which was what it was called still and always, by the valley and by the county records and by everyone who knew it. But anyone who came to that door knew who answered it. They knew whose handwriting was in the ledger margins. They knew whose opinion to ask about a contract and whose knowledge to ask about the land. And they understood that these were 2 different people and also, in some fundamental way, one operation, not because one had absorbed the other, but because each had expanded to contain the other, which is the only kind of partnership worth the name. The fire held through the night, as it always did now, as Elsa made sure it did. The 2 cups sat on the counter shelf where they had always sat, since the first weeks, since before either of them had admitted what they were becoming to each other. And Silas Rowan, a man who had once written a 12-item list of requirements for a wife and mailed it to Chicago, sat at his kitchen table in October and looked at the woman across from him and understood, not for the first time, but with the particular clarity that came from 10 years of accumulated evidence, that the best things in his life were the ones he hadn't known to ask for. He picked up his pencil. He went back to the numbers, and the ranch went on.